it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Ronald led his 2 charges along the steady descent. He knew of a trail that they'd explored last fall. The young women kept up. They were both fit, just scared. Well, now he noted that they appeared relieved. He was actually relieved as well. Something had taken those nice people. He had a nasty feel about it. He wanted the full team around him. They hustled down towards the river, and the forest grew in closely, and the trail became crowded. He didn't recall this stretch, but as long as it was downhill, he was sure it was in the right direction. When they took a rest break, he asked Dakota and Hannah how they were faring. They assured him that they were doing well. Ronald looked up and back the way they'd come. Looks like snow. It's probably already hitting the rest of the group. We should make it to the river before it starts in earnest. From within the heavy brush, a querulous voice called. Jenny's voice. Come on, help! It sounded familiar to their buddy, but weak and breathy, as though it was distressed. Ronald felt a little sick. There was no way Jenny could have beaten them or gotten ahead, was there? Well, perhaps if she and Jorge had left before us. Still, what were the chances that they'd end up on the same path? Jenny! Hannah called out toward the brush. She stood and craned her neck to see. Dakota stood alongside her. Ronald slowly rose to his feet. Wait, I don't think that's Jenny. If it is, she may be hurt. Stay here on the trail. I'll go look. It may have been a wild animal that took them. Just stay in place. Keep calling to her, reassure her. He stalked forward into the shadows and around the lower level growth. Jenny, Jorge, you there? Keep talking to us. Hannah and Dakota echoed his calls and encouragements. He found several large boulders from a long ago slide. They'd knocked over some larger trees and allowed the brush to grow. The voice sounded once more, this time from just on the other side of the largest rock. Come, help us. He caught a hint of white spikes, antlers. He realized they hovered just above the high point on the rock. Weird. He rounded the boulder. Just a weird pole with white painted antlers on top. He felt a bony arm envelop his throat from behind, and others entwined his arms, and he heard a last whisper in his right ear, in his own voice. Help. Jim looked tired. He was a pretty old man after all. This is not my specialty, but I've seen and heard of things like it. We're in a dangerous position. Probably best to stay here to wait. We definitely need to stay in pairs. They'd moved their camp into the saloon building as the snowstorm had increased its intensity throughout the afternoon and evening. John was tired himself and a little shaken. They'd rallied and then gone back to search the area where they'd heard the voices. There'd been nothing to see, and the snowfall had grown more intense until they gave up calling, gave up the search. Jorge and Jenny were out there, and they needed help. He resented that Harry and Jim had called off the efforts to come back here and huddle. Then the wind howled outside, and he realized that they'd been right. Still, human lives were at stake. He hated that they were right, flouting their competence. Harry shifted uncomfortably and looked at the howling walls. I hope Richard and the girls made it to the river. Maybe he was able to get out a transmission. Look, I'm not criticizing in any way, but I'm not so sure you actually heard Jorge and Jenny. The mountains can contain all kind of weird noises. The way the wind whispers through the trees, it can create audio illusions. No, delusions. I'm not trying to say anything offensive. He looked back into the fire that danced merrily in the central hearth. All kinds of strange noises in those woods. He gave a shiver and stared into the empty distance. Later, in the deep of night, a sound awakened John. He tried to burrow his body and consciousness back into peaceful slumber, but the sound grew louder and more intense. Pounding at the outer door. The winds howled with a little less fury, and a wailing voice demanded, "Help! Let me in!" It was Ronald's voice. Maybe they'd had to turn back and gotten caught in the snow. John sat up. He saw that the rest of the party was already awake and mostly up. Les and Kim sat together in their double sleeping bag. Harry stood near the inner door of the vestibule. Jim stood and was bent over his pack, his hand on something, but his face turned towards the entrance. Furious pounding. "Need your help," the voice wailed. "Well, are you going to let them inside?" Kim asked. "Sounds like Ronald and probably the girls. They need help." Jim rasped out quietly and coldly. "And that's not Ronald. And why would he need us to open the door? There's no lock on it. We pulled it to and flipped the wind latch, but that works on either side of the portal." Les joined in on his wife's side. "Well, maybe they're hurt. That would change his voice and maybe keep him from turning the latch." Harry looked over at Les. "I've known Ronald for several years. That's not him. Anyone who could pound that hard is not hurt too badly to flip a switch." John noted that Jim had stood erect. In his hand he clutched a gun, a squarish one with a long barrel. "Oh, I can't believe that crazy old bastard. Those are illegal. How do you even sneak it into the country? Oh, he's crazy. Why do you have that gun?" he stuttered out to his safety buddy. Jim spared him a glance. "Better have it, not need it, than to need it and not have it. Don't worry, it won't act on its own. Only does what I tell it to do. Unfortunately, I only have one spare magazine." He nodded to Harry, whose expression shifted from concern to relieved. The pounding shook the outer door until it quivered, and a screaming wail that sounded of several voices vying for one horrific note screamed in frustration and hate. The swooshing and howling of the wind increased as the last of the moaning wails drifted away in the storm. The pounding stopped and silence reigned. Eventually everyone settled and drifted into various states of consciousness. John's nerves were taut, and he shuddered with the thought of what might be out there in that storm, waiting. Hannah looked at Dakota in alarm. "Why won't he answer us?" Dakota looked back in consternation that verged on panic. I don't know. I think we should go. Just run." Her gaze darted down the trail the way they'd been headed. Hannah glanced back and forth between where Ronald had disappeared into the brush and boulders and the trail down which she'd wished to flee to with her friend. "He didn't go far. We should check on him. He may be hurt." "Help! Come here and help!" A quavering, hoarse version of Ronald's voice with a hint of vile hunger emitted from just beyond their sight. Both young women were startled and clutched at one another in fright. "I think it's Ronald. He must be hurt. We have to try and help him," Hannah insisted. Dakota still resisted. "No, wait. Didn't sound quite like him. I don't want to, wade off into that brush and behind those rocks. There could be, anything out there." Hannah decided the matter. She straightened and assumed a look of determination. "I'm going to check. But what if it's one of those things?" Dakota whined. Hannah ignored her friend and stalked forward along the same pathway that Ronald had used. She shortly rounded the big boulder and saw blood. Far too much blood. She opened her mouth and began to shriek when she looked just beyond the next set of rocks and saw the pale, thin figure with the spikes and antlers. The elongated face gaped at her. She barely felt the instant dull ache caused by blunt force trauma to the side of her head. Her vision grayed, and then, with the next blow to the base of her skull, it winked out and she plummeted into the endless dark. Dakota stood, shivering and bouncing in the cold, and with fear chasing through her nervous system. When she heard the sound of her friend's voice as it rose in terror and was cut suddenly short, she almost collapsed. Then from behind, she heard another voice. "Come on, help!" She fled as quickly as she could. She followed the path when she could see it, and otherwise simply ran in the direction with a downhill slope and the least resistance. She caught glimpses of the thing out amongst the boles and heavy branches. The pale, thin, spiky figure, too tall, too thin, the head misshapen. She never looked long enough to make out any details. And then it was there, in front of her, blocking her path. She skidded to a halt, too frightened and out of breath to scream. She cast her eyes about for any route of escape. Nothing. She turned 180 degrees and sprinted at her significantly diminished capacity. She made it a good 100 yards before she felt a tug at her toes, and the earth rushed up to meet her. The air whoofed from her lungs, and she lay there sprawled for a moment, stunned by the unexpected and hard impact. She began to scramble her limbs to rise and continue her precipitous flight, but a weight pressed on her back, pressed her down to the ground. Rough hands seized her arms and pulled them outward to either side. Something grasped her legs. She tried to turn over, but she was completely helpless. She heard a woman scream and screech, at first muffled and then very loudly. She realized that she heard her own piteous cries. "Come on," Hannah's voice shakily said. John really had to go. There was a bank of outhouses that ran behind the building, one of the reasons they'd chosen it. He was terribly afraid, but his personal situation had become urgent. There had been no more disturbances for hours. Everyone else snoozed quietly. He gave it up and rolled out of his sleeping bag. He dressed in his warmest attire and quietly left the building. He left the inner door unlatched and peeked out around the edges of the outer door frame before he slowly pushed open the outer door. The wind had died down considerably, and he saw that the snow had grown deep. It was still coming down heavily, so that he could see no more than 10 feet ahead of himself, even with his very nice flashlight. He made his way along the outer wall and followed it until he reached the area where he knew the facilities to be. He made it outside, and once he was free of his heaviest clothing and knew that he'd made it without making a mess, he sighed in relief. As he finished and realized that there was no TP, he fished in his pockets for some tissue paper. He'd kept plenty on hand for his leaky nose. He heard an odd noise just outside the little structure, a crunching squeak, faint but noticeable. He resumed his hygiene and heard it again, this time accompanied by heavy rasping. That stupid old bastard," he groused inwardly. "He followed me out to the crap. He takes this safety buddy garbage way too seriously. Maybe he just needed to go. Come on, let me in." It was indeed Jim's voice. Maybe. Yet it quavered and the pronunciation was off just enough. He froze in place. He squeezed his eyes shut and breathed in deeply. No mean accomplishment considering the stench of his current situation. When he dared open his eyes, he saw that the feeble light from outside had darkened even further for a moment, as he stared through the not quite evenly joined planks that made up the building. An eye gleamed through a knothole, a reddish, rheumy eye. He clicked on his flashlight and directed the beam at it. It vanished, and he heard a loud hiss from outside. And then the pounding began, like on the door to the saloon. It shook this much smaller and less stable structure. If he hadn't just finished, well, he would have crapped himself. Jim gently shook Harry awake. "Hey, buddy, they're back." As the guide rubbed his eyes and attempted to focus, Jim continued, "Outhouse. John's in the John." He stepped over and awakened Les and Kim. Everyone was groggy and unhappy. "We have to decide whether or not to rescue John, or just to wait out the darkness. It may not matter. Jorge and Jenny disappeared in the morning." The outer door banged open, and the inner door slowly inched inward as the group watched in horror and readiness. Jim properly gripped his pistol and took up a nice pyramid stance. Harry held his brush knife in one hand and his camp knife in the other, and stood posed as ready as he was able. Les and Kim each hefted their hardwood walking sticks. John's voice shivered from the other side of the door. "Come on, open the door." Bam! Shouts. Bam, 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 bam. Shouts and screams of fear and pain. Thuds of flesh striking flesh. Wet noises. The sounds rudely impinged on John's straining senses. He'd risen and gotten his clothes back in order, and now he had made a decision. He fled. He opened the door gently, looked around, and then bolted out and to one side, not the direction of the saloon doors. He darted around a few smaller structures and then turned toward the trail that led to his overlook. There were rocks there. He could find shelter away from the rest of the group, away from these things. The noises from the town faded even before he found his shelter. He knew then that he was on his own. Something was stalking him, something that was angry, hungry, and wasted. He'd heard of these monsters, read the tales of the other writers. Wendigo, if he recalled correctly. In any case, his best chance was to lie low until the snow stopped and dawn arrived. Then he could trek out of the area and back down to the river. He'd follow it until he found a town or settlement, even an isolated country home. In the meantime, he'd ignore it. That was the tactic that survivors had used in the stories. Maybe this was some other kind of cryptid or ghost. John's eyes snapped open, dry and stinging with the cold. He rubbed at them and stared around himself, disoriented for a moment. "Oh, crap. I fell asleep. I guess the rest will do me some good. Oh, looks like nothing killed or ate me." His thoughts wandered with fatigue and chill. He sat up and looked around to ensure that he was alone. He dug through his pockets and found a lone energy bar. Breakfast. Then a pea. Then, a flea. He stomped around for a little while and tried to get some blood flowing so that he could think straight. He recalled that the blood trail that Jim and Harry had followed led parallel to and occasionally followed an old fire road. It eventually reached a larger fire road. He could attempt to follow the trail that the group had taken with the dog sleds. It seemed the best option was most familiar to him, yet he'd have to circle the settlement. He didn't care to go back through those crazy old buildings. Forget the rest of the group. They had to be toast. With nothing else to do and a need for speed, he set off through the forest of fear to circle the town on the side away from the fire road of blood. No good options, he muttered to himself as he tromped through the now deep snow. Late morning, the snow began again, lighter and with less wind, but it made the trek ever more arduous. He circled the town and found the trail. It was hard to detect under the new pristine blanket of frost and snow, but he managed. About midday, he heard a cry in the distance, that same quavering, hungry wail that he'd heard that first night. He'd forgotten about this until that moment, and shuddered with the memory. He increased his pace for a while, but then slowed once more. He had to conserve his energy. The cold was leaching the vitality from him, and he stayed thirsty. He'd polished off the last of the water in his emergency bottle, stuffed away in his hooded parka. Well, he had to hand it to Harry and Ronald. They'd packed his gear well, had placed emergency rations in his immediate clothing. They were competent, so he'd have to give them a high rating on his review. He giggled a little, hysterically. No, seize control back from old Jack Frost. The wailing cry once more shattered any chance of calm. It was much closer. He'd been hunted and herded the rest of the day, crossing pathways, being driven into rank wilderness. Now here he was, pitiful weapons to hand, ready to make his last stand. "John, that you?" A querulous, rasping voice emanated from the dark. It sounded like, "No, not him. It's that thing. Naturally, we'll pick his voice." A tall, bulky shadow with a peaked, pointed head resolved itself, and shortly he saw puffs of steam rise from it. He realized that he had not seen this from the monster that had haunted his trail all day. He turned his now feeble light, its battery severely depleted, toward this new horror. "Don't shine it in my eyes," the voice rasped, clearly this time. "Just stay calm, and I'll help you." God, he was that old bastard Jim. He'd never been so glad to see another human being. "So, what were you going to do? Beam me with a rock?" John revised his estimation. Perhaps there were better people to encounter at this moment. The octogenarian pulled his hand from the pocket of his parka. It was full of pistol. Only one magazine left. 12 rounds total. Used up the first one, those first two, to get inside the saloon, and then 2 of their friends outside. Only wounded those 2. The rest poured them back into the woods. We followed, thinking that they had you. He assumed an angry look. I guess not. We started tracking again as soon as it was light enough. I picked up your trail just before dark. John listened, but wasn't sure he understood. "So, where are the rest?" Jim frowned. "We got ambushed around midday. Kim noticed that Les, who was covering the back end of our trail, had disappeared. She called out to us and then turned back to face down trail. She started to walk in that direction, and we heard Les's voice. But not, you know what I mean. Come on, Kim," he called. Harry and I called to her, but she walked around one of the big firs with branches that reached the ground. Well, by the time we got to where we should have been able to see her, she was gone. We called and looked for signs. Harry found a bloodstain in the snow. We don't know whose blood it was, but we decided to get out of the woods altogether. Followed him, what I thought they were. He was interrupted by a wailing cry. As it faded, it rose again from another direction, and then another. It had finally started to dawn on John, in his exhausted state, that there was no single monster in the dark. No, they were surrounded by many creatures or beings. What are they? "Welcome to the territory of the Wendigo tribe," Jim growled. John slowly cogitated through that statement. I thought that Wendigos were monsters that ate people. Legendary monsters." Jim sighed. "They're one of several groups that have become legends. The wilds are called wild for a reason. Tough place to live, to find sustenance, especially when the snows come. Some ancient folk turn to the food most readily at hand, their fellow ancient folk. One tribe in particular got mixed up with the mythologies of a few other tribes. Next thing you know, sneaky, cowardly cannibals became legendary monstrous spirits. The cries had faded, but now returned in earnest and from all directions. "Best get ready to fling those rocks, Johnny." Two pale figures emerged from the forest along the same path that Jim had arrived. One brandished a large hatchet and the other a slim javelin. The javelin thrower slowed for a moment to skip into his fling, but a dark figure enveloped his throwing arm and pulled him onto his back. "Harry!" John realized. They'd set an ambush for the Wendigos and used me as bait. He didn't have time to get too angry at them. The hatchet wielder was almost upon them. He let fly with the rock and caught the person in the chest. It let out a whoof of air and lowered the weapon. About that time he heard a terrible roar that filled his ears with a sharp pain and then ringing. A flash of flame set his eyes to watering. He realized that Jim had fired at a different threat altogether. More loud and bright bursts punished his senses, and then the bright night went quiet. John was numb, his heart pounded, and his stomach burned. He almost forgot how terribly cold he was. He looked up in time to see that the axeman had recovered and raised his weapon to strike Jim from behind. He was too slow in his perception, and action was out of the question. Fortunately for the old man, Harry had finished his victim, and now a line of dark red, barely visible in the wan light, fountained from Hatchet Boy's throat. He clutched at it, even as he fell to the soft but cold embrace of the snow. He could hear as if he were underwater, and the voices were on the bank. "Jim!" "I got the one in the pointy outfit, but the others swarmed him. His carcass is likely already gone. Best we get back to shelter and recover some supplies. Johnny boy doesn't look too fit." "I'll show you, you old bat." John didn't finish the thought. He realized that if he didn't get inside soon, he'd be dead. God, why is he so competent? There were plenty of supplies. The search party that looked for John had taken minimal items so that they could carry them if needs be. Jim and Harry made John strip off his clothes that were full of frozen sweat and kept him awake long enough to eat some broth and drink a bottle of water. The hot meal and beginning of rehydration awakened him enough that he started to pay attention. He saw that Jim sat down heavily and turned his back. Harry approached with his little first aid kit. "I'm sorry, Mr. Broxton. Jim, I don't have much here, to dull the pain, but you need some stitches to close up that wound." John saw that there was a large triple gash across the old man's back. Like something a claw would make. "That's all right, Harry Harefoot. Your turn next, and that poke in your hide will need to be cleaned and repacked. We'll get both a dose of pain. Too bad none of these bottles in the old saloon had anything left." An enormous weight of fatigue overwhelmed John. As he faded into exhausted slumber, he heard the easy conversation between two men who had striven against death to save a comrade, one for whom they did not particularly care. Him. He faded into a deep sleep that eventually resolved into a nightmare-ridden misery. The pale, spiky thing stood before him. Other vague figures danced around. He was tied to a pole and could not move his limbs. He ached everywhere and burned. They were burning him. No, cooking him at the stake. He was a steak on a stake. Sharp points needled at him, and the pale, shaggy beings closed in and started to reveal their faces. One by one, the guides, the girls, the couples, and finally, Jim. His face grew and distorted. The antlers rose from the crown of his face elongated and his jaws slavered and gaped. He shook. He felt a pressure in his side and then shook again. He felt the back of an ice-cold hand touch his forehead. The cold, dead touch of the Wendigo, his mind shouted. A voice, muffled and quavering, perhaps a little hungry, sounded at the edge of his hearing. "We'd be best getting this one moving. He's burning up with a fever," the voice rasped. John had vague impressions of movement, of a strong breeze, of a whirring sound, and then he floated. He thought that he must be back in the dream world. Probably be summer before they can get search teams back up that way. Armed search teams, I'm sure. John knew that voice. Ron. No, Harry. Then the voice he feared would answer spoke. My old outfit will likely have it resolved by then. Just a matter of recovering bodies and giving the family some closure. A real shame what animal predation can do. Animals? John forced his eyes open and attempted to speak his disdain at that lie. Yet all that he could manage was a squeaky croak. Johnny boy, you've decided to live. Well enough. Jim sounded almost disappointed to John's ear. Yes, everyone of consequence has agreed that was what happened. It'd be best for you to agree. There are rewards for those who play the game and less positive consequences for those who don't. Midsummer. They found clothing and a few bones. Looks like Ronald and Hannah. No signs of the other girl, Dakota. And they'll keep searching. Those DMT Solutions folks did a good job finding what was left of the party. The forestry manager informed his superior. That old man had some kind of tracking device, at least that's what we guessed. He had no phone or radio. Apparently his daughter is some high muckety-muck at the corporation. I can't believe they got a chopper up that way so soon after a storm and knew right where to go. Well, our folks didn't even know that the party was in distress. The girl, who'd once thought of herself as Dakota Dawson, gnawed hungrily at the gristle still attached to the long bone her mate had provided to her. She'd fought the people of the tribe fiercely at first. Then she'd sunken into a dark depression. Somewhere along the way, she'd snapped and subconsciously made the decision to join them. She was now a proud member of the Wendigo Nation. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.